saddest thing that a parent could ever say, and God said it. Now that's the background, and God decided to wipe them all out with water. And the waters came down from the sky, and up from below water was gushing from every direction. And the flood came and destroyed everybody but just 8 people. One man was living right. He was a righteous man. And that man had persuaded his wife, 3 sons, and 3 daughters-in-law to live right in the same way. And God saved them, told him to build a boat in the middle of dry land. While everybody laughed at him, he knew what he was doing. And he trusted and obeyed God. By faith, Noah built an ark. And they were safe. As soon as they came out, God made the first covenant with human beings ever. Bound himself to a promise voluntarily. He was not under obligation to say it, but the promise was basically very simple. I promise I will never do that again as long as the earth remains. Furthermore, that's a negative promise, that he promised not to do it again, but there's a positive side to it. He promised to make sure that the human race survived by looking after the food problem, by looking after the seasons, by seeing that there was always enough food in the world for everybody to go to bed satisfied. And do you know God has kept that promise? In spite of the growing numbers of people in the world today, there is every single year enough food in the world for everybody to have enough. Yet 1/3 of the world goes to bed hungry, and 1/3 of the world goes to bed starving. Why? God has done his bit and put enough food in the world for everybody. Why then all this hunger? The answer is we won't share it out. And some nations have too much food and others have far too little. And some nations are obese and trying to get slim, and other nations are too slim and desperate to get a bite to eat. That's not God's fault. That's ours. God has done his bit. And I have the figures of the United Nations Food Organization to prove it. Every year, there is enough food in the world for everybody to have their 2,500 calories. But we will not share it. That's the problem. Well, now, God has done his bit. And the springtime and harvest and summer and winter have faithfully come round. We take it for granted. We don't even thank him for bringing it back again. But I was thanking him this morning in my heart when I saw the trees beginning to bud. Isn't spring lovely? You can smell it. You can smell the life surging again. And it's God who does that. And we should jolly well thank him for it. Now, it's interesting that 2 things we need more than anything else are light and moisture, sun and rain. And when God sends both together, you'll see an unusual thing, a rainbow. All the colors of the rainbow appear when sun and rain come together. And God says, that's my reminder. That's my ring. Just as that ring reminds me I'm married and made promises to a little lady who's waiting for me back home, God says that ring will remind me of the promise I've made to the human race. He doesn't say, you look at it and it'll remind you of my covenant. He says, I will look at it and it'll remind me to go on feeding the human race. Now, why did he make this covenant? By the way, you should have now 1 page with this chart on it. The other page is for tonight. And you've got it just in case you can't come tonight, or You can watch me at home on the internet, or you can do what you wish, but this is the page for now. And each of the covenants, we're looking at 6 things. First of all, the party, who is the covenant with? Then the promise on which the covenant is based, I will. That's the most frequent thing that God ever said. It's all the way through the Bible, I will. And that's what you say when you get married. And it's what God says when he makes a covenant. And we ask there, what is the promise offering? And then the third thing we ask, does God expect anything in return? Is there a proviso attached to the covenant? Then we ask, is there a penalty attached which will punish us if we don't keep the covenant? Then we ask, how long will it last? What period does it cover, this promise? And finally, what is God's purpose in making the covenant? So we've already dealt with the Noah covenant. Let's look down the left-hand column. Those are the 5 covenants we're going to talk about. And we call them after the name of the person with whom God made it. So we call the Noah covenant the Noahic covenant. Then he made another with Abraham, and we call it the Abrahamic covenant. Then he made one with Moses, the Mosaic covenant. Then the one he made with King David, the Davidic. And finally, the one he made through Christ, the Messiah, the Messianic. These are the 5 covenants around which the whole Bible story revolves. And I want you to notice already that only one of those is called the Old Covenant, and that's Moses. And only one of them is called the New Covenant, and that's the Messianic. So that's a bit enlightening to begin with. Because the word covenant and the word testament are, of course, the same word. And it's a tragedy that the 2 halves of our Bible were ever called the Old Testament and the New Testament, which mean the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, which gives the wrong impression. There are only 2 covenants in the Bible, the old one and the new one. And that's not the picture at all. But it has misled a lot of people to think that the Old Testament is now out of date and past its sell-by date. There are many Christians today who are not studying the Old Testament. They're studying the New, but they're not studying the Old, because they think it's the old one, the out-of-date covenant. It isn't. One of the covenants in the Old Testament is out of date, but the others are still in date. Indeed, the Noah covenant is still operating. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have any food to eat. There wouldn't be spring buds on the trees now, unless the Noah covenant was still in operation. God is still sending his sun on the good and the evil, and his rain on the just and the unjust. Well, now let's go back to the Noah covenant and go along the top row. Not only was this covenant made with Noah, but through him the whole human race. And it was made on Mount Ararat when the ark came to rest after the flood. The promise is basically a promise of survival, that the human race would be kept going by God, that he would keep the food going. It was an international covenant because it was made with everybody. It's not a Jewish covenant at all. It's with everybody, including the Jews, of course, but all the Gentile nations belong to this covenant. And the seasons would continue, the sun and rain would continue. What was expected of us by God? He didn't make anything a condition. As the next column shows, it was an unconditional covenant. Therefore, whether we do what we're expected by God to do or not,